Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to Games as Lit 101. In talking about video games, we've appropriated the literary language of perspective to talk about how we see things happening visually on screen. And indeed, video games have something of a habit of taking established literary concepts and changing their meaning a little bit to better fit with the visual and interactive nature of this medium. The idea of perspective has been adapted in a few interesting ways, most notably that in video games, perspective is a matter of visuals rather than narration. There are three perspectives in writing: the first person, second person, and third person. First person is when a story is being told by someone who is also the subject of the story itself. For instance, if I tell you about all the times my cats got into the shot while making this show, I'm talking from the first person perspective, using pronouns like I and my to tell a story about myself. Second person is when the reader is being addressed directly, like when the classic text adventure Zork tells you that you're likely to be eaten by a grue unless you find some light. And third person is when a story is being told about someone else entirely, using pronouns like him and hers. Most stories are written in this perspective. But as you can imagine, these concepts change a little bit when we apply them to a visual medium, let alone an interactive one like video games, so we use the terminology a little differently. In video games, perspectives aren't based on narration, but on visual presentation. First person becomes a matter of literally seeing through the eyes of the player character. Second person would be seeing through the eyes of someone other than the player character, and third person is seeing the player character from a disembodied outside perspective. Now, visually speaking, of course, this all makes perfect sense. A first-person novel is written from the perspective of the protagonist, and a first-person video game is seen from the perspective of the protagonist. But if you look at the differences in how we use the concept and terminology of perspective in video games versus written literature, you might notice something of an interesting difference. Let's take a closer look at the first and third person perspectives in video games. In third person, everything that happens on screen is happening to the character you're playing. You may control and identify with this character, but looking at the events on the screen, Drake is being shot at, Drake is jumping across a gap, and Drake is walking through the jungle. Which is, of course, perfectly in line with the literary concept of the third-person perspective. He is doing things, and he is having things done to him. Not you, not I, but him. On the other hand, look at how the action unfolds in a first-person shooter. When you're shot at, bullets fly directly at the screen. In other words, at you. When people talk to Gordon Freeman, they look directly at you. The goal of a story written in first person is to put you inside the mind of the protagonist. The goal of a game presented in first person is to make you the protagonist. Interesting thing is, when we look at it that way, first person games don't sound like first person narrative delivery at all. In fact, everything I just described there was very clearly second person. At least in moment-by-moment presentation, the first-person perspective in video games exists specifically to immerse you fully in the experience, to make you feel like you're there and all this is happening to you. And also because the perspective helps with precision-based shooting action, but we're talking about narrative delivery here, which makes it seem like first-person games actually have more in common with the second-person perspective in a literary sense. Now, it's notable that the idea of a game speaking directly to you, the player, instead of to the protagonist is not whatsoever limited to first-person games. In fact, it's a nearly universal element of this medium. When I'm playing even a third-person game like Spyro the Dragon and I get hit by an enemy, I don't think, oh no, Spyro got hit. I think, oh no, I got hit. And for that matter, there are plenty of games that aren't presented in the first-person perspective that work hard to make the protagonist a representation of you. In many ways, video games are an inherently second-person medium, simply because we interact with them in a way we don't with non-interactive media. Regardless of what perspective the story is told from, we still identify with the protagonist in a fundamental and visceral way, because we are controlling them and inhabiting them to some extent. But games can still employ various literary perspectives, and while there's an inherent second-person element to most of them, first-person games tend to bring it out more than other formats. The thing to keep in mind is that perspective isn't just about visual presentation or game mechanics, it's about who the action is happening to. When it's happening to a person on screen, the action is happening to them. But when it's done to a character whose eyes you're literally seeing through, it's very intentionally meant to be happening not only to them, but to you. And that's the pure essence of the second-person perspective. Now, I'm not arguing that we change our terminology or anything like that. When it comes down to it, first person is a perfectly adequate term to describe this kind of visual presentation of gameplay. But I do of course think that there's value in considering how video games interact with classic concepts of literature and storytelling, and considering how the first-person perspective in video games shifts us into something of a second-person space offers a perspective shift of its own in how we consider video games and relate to them. If you have any interesting thoughts on the subject, I would love to read about them in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like it, subscribe to the channel, and check the description of this video for links to Games as Lit 101 on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon if you would like to support the show. Next time I'll be analyzing the first season of Telltale's Walking Dead series, so make sure to bring some tissues and I'll see you then. Class dismissed.